It's strange how the most powerful person in the room is often the one no one bothers to notice. And on a warm Saturday evening in downtown Manhattan, inside a ballroom glowing with crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors, that truth was about to cost a billionaire family $60 billion, but no one at table 7 knew it yet. Especially not the man laughing loud enough to turn heads as he swirled his glass of aged scotch and leaned back in his chair like he owned not just the building but the future being negotiated inside it, because when he looked at the woman seated quietly across from him, he didn't see a decision-maker, he saw a mistake. "I'm sorry," he said with a smirk that spread slowly, deliberately, "but who invited you to this table?" And just like that, the air shifted, conversations nearby softened into silence, forks paused mid-air, and a few eyes turned toward the woman in question. Naomi Carter, who sat still, composed, dressed in a simple black dress that carried no logo, no label, nothing that signaled wealth to the untrained eye, her posture straight, her expression unreadable, her presence almost too calm for a room built on ego and noise. And yet that calm wasn't weakness, it was calculation, because Naomi had walked into rooms like this her entire life and learned one thing early: people reveal everything about themselves the moment they think you are beneath them. The man across from her chuckled again, louder this time, drawing approval from the others seated beside him, his family, known across financial circles as one of the most aggressive investment dynasties in the country, old money, old power, and very used to being the loudest voice in any negotiation. "Let me guess," another voice chimed in, a woman with diamond bracelets catching the light as she crossed her arms. "Assistant PR maybe." A few soft laughs followed, not all comfortable, but none brave enough to interrupt, and Naomi didn't respond. Not immediately, she simply looked at them, one by one, as if memorizing faces, measuring tone, filing away every word like entries in a ledger, because this wasn't new to her, not the assumptions, not the dismissive glances, not the quiet erasure of her presence before she even spoke. And yet something about tonight felt sharper, heavier, like the room itself was leaning in, waiting to see how far this would go. "We're discussing a $60 billion acquisition," the man continued, his voice dropping into something colder now, more pointed. "This isn't exactly a place for spectators." The word lingered, deliberate, and a few guests shifted in their seats, the tension now unmistakable, but Naomi still didn't raise her voice, didn't defend herself, didn't correct them. She simply reached for the glass of water in front of her, took a slow sip, and placed it back down with precise control, the kind of control that didn't belong to someone out of place, but no one at that table recognized it, not yet, because to them, she was still invisible, still an outsider who had somehow wandered into a room reserved for power, and that illusion, that dangerous, blinding illusion, was about to unravel in a way none of them were prepared for. Naomi did not rush to fill the silence, because silence, when held long enough, begins to expose people more clearly than words ever could, and around that table the discomfort started to ripple in subtle ways, a shifting of posture, a glance exchanged too quickly, the faint clink of a glass set down just a little too hard, but the man who had spoken first did not notice any of it, or if he did, he mistook it for validation, which made him lean forward, elbows resting on the polished surface as if he were closing in on a deal that was already his. "Look," he said, lowering his voice just enough to sound controlled but not enough to hide the edge, "we have partners flying in from 3 states, we have attorneys on standby, and we have a timeline that does not include confusion, so I am going to ask you one more time, who exactly are you here with?" The question hung in the air like a test no one expected her to pass. And still Naomi did not answer right away, her eyes moving briefly to the far end of the ballroom where a line of floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the city lights stretching for miles, the skyline steady, unmoved, a reminder that real power did not need to announce itself, it simply existed. "Maybe she got lost," the woman with the diamond bracelets added, her tone lighter now but no less cutting. "These events can be overwhelming if you are not used to them." A few quiet laughs followed, thinner this time, less certain, because something about Naomi's stillness was beginning to feel intentional, like she was allowing this to happen rather than being caught in it, and that thought, once it appeared, was difficult to ignore. A younger man seated 2 chairs down cleared his throat and leaned slightly toward the group. "I think her badge might be," he started, but the first man raised a hand, cutting him off. Without looking, "We are handling it," he said, the kind of interruption that was less about control and more about habit, because in rooms like this, authority was often performed before it was earned. Naomi finally shifted then, not dramatically, just enough to reach for the small leather folder placed neatly beside her plate, her movements precise, unhurried, the kind that made people watch even when they did not understand why. She opened it halfway, glanced inside as if confirming something only she could see, then closed it again and rested her hand lightly on top, her gaze returning to the man across from her, calm, steady, and for the first time, unmistakably focused. "You are right about one thing," she said, her voice even, measured, carrying just far enough to reach the edges of the table without rising above them, and the shift was immediate. Conversations nearby quieted again, attention narrowing like a lens being adjusted. Because now she was speaking, and something in her tone suggested that this was not a defense, it was a statement. "This room does not have time for confusion," she continued, and for a brief moment, the man smiled as if he had won, as if she had finally stepped into the role he assigned her, but then she added, "Which is exactly why I am still here," and the smile faltered, just slightly, just enough to register, because confidence without explanation is unsettling. It disrupts the script people rely on, and across the table. The woman with the bracelet straightened, her expression tightening. "Excuse me," she said, the word sharper now, less amused. Naomi did not react to the tone, she simply held their attention the way someone holds a door open, not forcing anyone through it but making it impossible to ignore the space beyond, and somewhere in the background, a phone buzzed once, then again. Faint but persistent, the kind of sound that usually goes unnoticed until it does not, and though no one reached for it yet, the timing felt off, like a note slightly out of place in an otherwise perfect performance. Naomi's fingers tapped once, softly, against the leather folder, not nervous, not impatient, just deliberate, as if marking the beginning of something already set in motion. The room did not explode into chaos the way moments like this often do, instead it tightened, like something invisible had begun to pull every conversation inward toward that table, toward Naomi, toward the quiet certainty in her voice that refused to match the role they had assigned her, and the man across from her felt it first, not as fear but as irritation. The kind that comes when control slips just enough to be noticed but not enough to be explained. "You are still here," he repeated. Slower now, his smile gone, replaced by something flatter, more deliberate, "Because no one has asked security to escort you out yet," and a few heads around the table nodded, relief flickering briefly as if the script had been corrected, as if the world made sense again. But Naomi did not react to the implication, she simply tilted her head slightly, considering him, not as an equal, not even as a threat, but as a variable that had already been accounted for, and that was the moment the second phone buzzed, louder this time, closer, a sharp vibration against polished wood that drew eyes downward before anyone could pretend not to hear it. The woman with the diamond bracelets glanced at her screen and frowned, her confidence flickering for the first time as she read the notification twice, then a third time. "That is strange," she muttered under her breath, but not quietly enough, because now the man beside her was checking his own phone, then another across the table, and suddenly the silence was no longer controlled, it was fractured, broken into pieces by the soft glow of screens lighting up one by one. Naomi remained still, her hands resting lightly on the leather folder, her gaze steady, watching the shift not with satisfaction but with recognition, because she had seen this pattern before, the moment when certainty begins to unravel and people reach for information to stabilize it, but information, when it arrives all at once, does the opposite. It destabilizes everything. "Is this a glitch?" someone asked, his voice low, almost cautious, as if speaking too loudly might make it real. The man at the head of the table waved a dismissive hand. "It is probably nothing," he said quickly, too quickly. These systems update all the time, but even he had pulled out his phone now, and the way his jaw tightened as he read told a different story. Naomi's fingers tapped once more against the folder, a quiet rhythm that seemed to match the rising tension in the room, not rushed, not nervous, just precise, as if she were counting down to something only she could see. "You should answer that," she said calmly, her voice cutting cleanly through the overlapping murmurs, and it was not a suggestion, it was an observation, because at that exact moment, his phone began to ring, not vibrate, not buzz, but ring, loud enough to demand attention, the kind of call that does not wait, that does not repeat itself, and for a second, he hesitated, caught between maintaining authority and responding to whatever was unfolding beyond his control. But authority, in that moment, lost, he answered, turning slightly away from the table as if distance could contain what was about to be said. "This better be important," he snapped, but the voice on the other end did not match his tone. It cut through it, sharp, urgent. And whatever he heard in the next few seconds drained the color from his face, not dramatically, not all at once, but in a slow, undeniable shift that everyone at the table could see. Naomi did not lean forward, did not ask questions, did not interrupt, she simply watched, because the unraveling had already begun, and in rooms like this, once it starts, it does not stop. The conversation on the other end of the line did not last long, but it did not need to, because whatever was said carried the kind of weight that does not require repetition. It simply lands and settles, and as the man slowly lowered his phone, the confidence that once filled his posture had thinned into something uncertain, something exposed. His eyes flicking briefly toward Naomi before quickly shifting away as if direct eye contact might confirm something he was not ready to admit. What is it? The woman with the diamond bracelets asked, her voice no longer smooth, now edged with impatience that masked a growing unease, but he did not answer immediately, his mind clearly racing through possibilities, searching for a version of events that still left him in control, and that hesitation, that single pause, said more than any explanation could, because in rooms like this, powerful people do not hesitate unless something has already gone wrong. It is a misunderstanding, he said finally, though the words sounded more like a hope than a statement. Legal is reviewing something on the deal structure, but even as he spoke, more phones began to ring, not one, not two, but several, overlapping tones breaking whatever illusion of order remained, and now the attention of the entire table shifted fully, not toward Naomi, but toward the disruption spreading through their own devices, their own channels, their own carefully controlled systems. The younger man who had tried to speak earlier answered his call with a quick hello, only to fall silent seconds later, his expression tightening as he listened, his free hand gripping the edge of the table as if anchoring himself to something steady. What do you mean suspended? He said, louder than intended, and that word, suspended, cut through the noise like a cracking glass, immediate and impossible to ignore. Naomi did not move, but her presence seemed to expand in that moment. Not physically, but in the way attention began to orbit her again. Drawn back from the chaos they could not yet understand. This is not possible, the woman said, now checking her own phone again, her fingers moving faster, her confidence unraveling with each passing second. We had confirmation this morning, everything was locked in. Naomi's gaze remained steady, her silence now heavier, no longer passive, but active, like a pressure that built without sound, and then another voice joined. One of the advisors seated near the end of the table. I just got an alert from compliance, he said, his tone careful, controlled, but unable to hide the shift underneath. The acquisition is on hold pending executive review. The words landed harder than any accusation, because they came from inside their own system, their own structure, and for the first time, the man at the head of the table looked directly at Naomi, not with dismissal, not with irritation, but with something closer to recognition. As if a piece of the puzzle had finally aligned in a way he could not ignore. Who are you? He asked again, but this time the question carried weight, real weight, not a challenge, not a dismissal, but a need, because whatever was happening was no longer theoretical, it was immediate, it was real, and it was affecting something far bigger than a social misstep at a dinner table. Naomi let the silence stretch just a moment longer, long enough for the room to feel it, long enough for every eye to return to her, and then she placed her hand flat on the leather folder, steady, grounded, as if marking the exact point where everything changed. I told you, she said calmly, her voice even, controlled, there is no time for confusion tonight, and as she spoke, another phone rang, then another, and this time, no one ignored it, because the pattern was no longer subtle, it was undeniable, something had been set in motion, and it was not slowing down. By now the room was no longer pretending to function as a formal negotiation space, it had transformed into something else entirely, something unstable, where authority was no longer defined by titles or seating arrangements but by who understood what was happening and who did not, and at that table, it was becoming painfully clear that only one person truly did, because while the billionaire family scrambled between calls, messages, and fragmented explanations, Naomi Carter remained still, her composure untouched, her presence now impossible to dismiss. This does not make any sense, the woman with the diamond bracelet said again, her voice tighter, sharper, as she scrolled through her phone, refreshing the same screen as if repetition might restore control. We had board approval, we had legal clearance, this deal was finalized, but the words sounded weaker each time they were spoken, because reality was no longer aligning with expectation. And across from her, the man who had first mocked Naomi leaned forward, both hands now flat on the table, his earlier arrogance replaced by something more urgent, more calculating. Get me corporate, he said into his phone, his tone no longer performative but direct, stripped of theatrics. "I want to know who authorized this hold." And for the first time, the answer came quickly, too quickly, his expression shifting as he listened, his jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing, and when he spoke again, it was quieter, controlled, but edged with something unmistakable. "What do you mean executive override?" The phrase landed like a weight in the center of the table, heavy, immovable, because executive override was not a suggestion, it was not a delay, it was a command, one that came from a level above negotiation, above influence, above everything they had assumed was already secured. And now every pair of eyes turned back to Naomi, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of necessity, because the pattern was too clear to ignore, the timing too precise, the disruption too aligned with her presence. "You did this," the woman said, not as an accusation but as a realization, her voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier edge, and Naomi did not rush to respond. She simply met her gaze, steady, unflinching, allowing the weight of that realization to settle fully before speaking. "No," she said calmly, and for a split second, relief flickered across a few faces, quick, fragile, but then she continued, "I stopped this," and that distinction, subtle but absolute, shifted everything, because stopping something that powerful did not come from luck, it did not come from coincidence, it came from authority, real authority, the kind that does not ask for permission, the kind that does not explain itself in advance, and the silence that followed was deeper than anything before it, not empty, but full, filled with the sound of people rethinking every assumption they had made in the last 10 minutes, every word they had said, every look they had given, and somewhere behind them, a chair scraped softly against the marble floor as another guest stood, no longer pretending not to watch, because this was no longer a private moment, it was a shift, a visible, undeniable shift in power unfolding in real time. "That is not possible," the man said finally, but his voice lacked conviction now, the certainty gone, replaced by a question he was not ready to ask out loud, and Naomi, still seated, still composed, rested her hand once more on the leather folder and spoke with quiet precision. "You should have asked that question earlier," she said, her tone neither harsh nor forgiving, just factual, "before you decided who belonged at this table." And this time, no one laughed, no one interrupted, because the room had already begun to understand that the answer to that question was not something they were going to like. The silence that followed her words did not feel empty anymore, it felt heavy, like the entire room was waiting for something to confirm what everyone was beginning to suspect but no one was ready to say out loud, and in that wait, the smallest sounds became amplified, the faint hum of the air conditioning, the distant clink of glass from another table, the subtle shift of chairs as people adjusted themselves not out of comfort but out of unease, because the balance had changed and they could all feel it, even if they did not yet understand how or why. The man at the head of the table exhaled slowly, a controlled breath meant to reset the moment, to reassert something resembling order, but when he spoke again, his voice carried less authority than before. "If you think pausing this deal gives you leverage," he said carefully, choosing each word like it might still restore his position, "you are underestimating how this works." But even as he said it, his eyes did not leave Naomi's, searching for a reaction, a crack, something human he could challenge, and Naomi did not give him any of it. She simply listened, her expression unchanged, as if his words were not a threat but a confirmation of exactly what she already knew. "No," she replied softly, not interrupting, not raising her voice, just placing the word into the space between them with quiet precision. "You are underestimating how this works." And the difference was immediate, because when she said it, it did not sound like an opinion, it sounded like a fact, something already proven, something already in motion. And that was when the advisor at the end of the table spoke again, his voice tighter now, less composed. "It is not just on hold," he said, glancing down at his screen, then back up at the group. "The funding pipeline has been frozen, all outbound transfers are restricted until further notice." And that sentence landed harder than anything before it, because money was not theoretical, it was measurable, immediate, and when it stopped moving, everything stopped with it. The woman with the bracelet shook her head, almost in disbelief. "That is not possible without board approval," she insisted, her voice rising slightly, clinging to the structure she believed still existed, and Naomi finally shifted forward, just slightly, enough to rest both hands on the table, her posture still composed but now undeniably engaged, and when she spoke, her voice did not need to rise to command attention, it already had it. "You keep referring to systems like they protect you," she said calmly, her tone steady, deliberate, but systems only follow authority. She let the word settle for a moment, not rushing, not filling the silence. Allowing the meaning to unfold on its own, and across from her, the man's expression changed again, not fully, not yet, but enough to show that something had clicked, something uncomfortable, something unavoidable. Who authorized it? He asked again, but this time the question was not directed at his team, it was directed at her, fully, directly, without pretense, and Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, her eyes steady, her voice quiet but absolute. The same person you dismissed 10 minutes ago, she said, and the room seemed to stop, not dramatically, not with sound, but with awareness, because now the pieces were no longer scattered, they were aligned, and every assumption made earlier in the evening began to collapse under the weight of a single realization, one that none of them could undo, no matter how much they wished they could go back and speak differently, act differently, see differently. But time in rooms like this does not rewind, it only reveals. The realization did not arrive all at once, it spread across the table in fragments, in shifting expressions, in the way shoulders straightened too late and eyes avoided meeting hers, because now every word that had been spoken earlier was replaying in their minds with a different meaning, a heavier consequence, and for the first time that evening, no one interrupted Naomi, no one laughed, no one tried to redirect the conversation, because the room had already chosen its center and it was no longer the loudest voice, it was the quietest one, the one that had not needed to prove anything until now. The man at the head of the table leaned back slowly, not in comfort but in calculation, his mind moving quickly through scenarios, searching for a path that still preserved control, still preserved image, but every option required one thing he was not used to offering, acknowledgement, if that is true. He said carefully, each word measured, deliberate, then this has been a misunderstanding, and the word hung there, fragile, insufficient, because misunderstanding implies mutual confusion, and there had been none on Naomi's side, only observation, only patience, only precision. She did not correct him, she did not challenge the wording, she simply let it sit, because sometimes the most powerful response is allowing someone to hear their own words and realize how small they sound. The woman with the bracelet shifted in her seat, her earlier confidence gone, replaced by something closer to urgency. We can fix this, she said quickly, leaning forward now, her tone softening, adjusting, adapting. Whatever happened here, it does not need to affect the deal, and that was the moment the dynamic became undeniable, because the same voices that had dismissed Naomi minutes ago were now trying to negotiate with her, not openly, not directly, but unmistakably, their focus no longer on each other, no longer on the agreement, but on her. You are right, Naomi said calmly, her voice steady, her posture unchanged. It did not need to affect the deal, and for a brief second, hope flickered again, fragile but present, until she continued, but your actions made sure it did, and the sentence landed with quiet finality, not raised, not emphasized, just stated, and across the table. The advisor who had been monitoring the situation spoke again, his voice lower now, more cautious. I am getting confirmation, he said, glancing at his screen, then back up. The cancellation is not temporary, it is permanent. All contracts tied to this acquisition are being dissolved, and that word, dissolved, carried a different weight than hold, than pause, than review. It meant final, it meant irreversible, and for a moment, no one spoke, not because they had nothing to say, but because they understood that whatever they said now would not change what had already been set in motion. The man's hand tightened slightly around his phone, his control slipping in ways he could no longer hide. You are walking away from $60 billion, he said, his voice lower, almost incredulous, as if saying the number out loud might shift the scale back in his favor, might remind her of what she was giving up. But Naomi did not react to the number, not the way they expected, because to her, it was not a loss, it was a decision, and decisions, when backed by real power, are not emotional, they are exact. No, she said quietly, meeting his gaze without hesitation, I am walking away from a table that decided I did not belong at it, and the distinction was absolute, because in that moment, it was no longer about money, it was about principle, about power, about the cost of underestimating someone who never needed their approval to begin with, and as the weight of that truth settled over the room, it became clear that the deal had not just been cancelled, something else had been exposed, something far more valuable and far more difficult to recover from, the illusion that they had been in control all along. For a moment, no one at the table moved, not because they were frozen but because they were recalculating, every person in that room silently revisiting the last 15 minutes as if they could edit it in real time, as if they could take back the laughter, the assumptions, the careless words that had felt so effortless when they believed Naomi Carter was irrelevant, and yet Naomi herself did not rush to leave, did not stand up, did not claim the moment with any visible triumph. She simply sat there, composed, her presence now heavier than any number that had been mentioned that night, because power, when it is real, does not celebrate, it settles, it lingers, it forces others to confront what they missed, and as the silence stretched, something shifted inside her as well, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else could see, but inwardly, like a quiet echo rising from a place far older than this room, far deeper than this single moment, because this was not the first time she had been underestimated, not the first time someone had looked at her and decided she did not belong, and as she sat there, listening to the faint hum of confusion around her, her mind moved somewhere else for just a second, back to a smaller room years ago, a conference space with flickering fluorescent lights and a long table where she had once stood as the only black woman in the room, presenting a proposal she had spent months building, only to be interrupted halfway through by a man who never even looked up from his notes as he said, "We are looking for someone with more experience to lead this," and the room had nodded, not because they knew, but because they assumed, and she had stood there, holding her composure the same way she did now, not arguing, not raising her voice, just absorbing the moment and storing it somewhere precise, somewhere permanent, and then there was another memory, sharper, colder, a luxury office lobby in Chicago where she had arrived early for a meeting only to be directed toward the service entrance by someone who never asked her name, never checked her credentials, just decided based on appearance alone where she should go, and she had walked out that day without correcting them, not because she could not, but because she understood something they did not, that correction in that moment would change nothing, but success later would change everything, and now, back in the present, seated at a table where $60 billion had just disappeared with a single decision, those moments did not feel distant, they felt connected, like pieces of a pattern that had finally completed itself, and across from her, the man who had once laughed now looked at her with a different kind of focus, not curiosity, not arrogance, but something closer to realization, as if he was seeing not just who she was, but everything that had led her to this exact point. "This was never about the deal for you, was it?" he said quietly, not as a challenge, but as a recognition of something deeper. And Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, her voice steady. "No," she said, and for the first time, there was a trace of something beneath the control, not anger, not resentment, but clarity. It was about making sure this does not happen again, and the weight of that statement settled differently than anything before it, because it was no longer just about them, no longer just about this table, it was about every room like it, every moment like the one she had lived through, every assumption that had gone unchallenged until now, and as the realization spread, quiet but undeniable, it became clear that what had just happened here was not an isolated event, it was a line being drawn, precise, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. The weight of her words did not fade after she spoke them, it expanded, filling the space between every person at that table until there was no room left for denial, no room left for the kind of casual arrogance that had defined the first half of the evening, because now the situation was no longer abstract, it was personal, it was immediate, and it was irreversible. The man across from her straightened slightly, his posture adjusting not out of comfort but out of necessity, as if he were trying to meet the moment on equal ground, even though that ground had already shifted beneath him. "Then what happens now?" he asked, his voice quieter, more measured, stripped of the confidence that had once made it commanding, and for the first time, it was not a rhetorical question, it was real, because he no longer controlled the outcome. Naomi did not answer immediately, not because she needed time, but because she understood the value of silence in moments like this. It allowed the question to settle, to carry its full weight before the response arrived. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, deliberate, as if every word had already been decided long before this evening began. "Now," she said, "the system continues," and the phrase seemed simple, almost understated, but the effect was immediate, because everyone at that table understood what it meant. This was not a single action, not a one-time decision, it was a process, something already moving beyond this room, beyond this conversation, something that would continue whether they accepted it or not. The advisor at the end of the table checked his phone again, his expression tightening further. "Legal has confirmed," he said, his tone more formal now, almost detached, as if distancing himself from the situation he was reporting. "All associated partnerships tied to this acquisition are being reviewed, secondary agreements are being flagged for compliance risk," and the implications of that statement stretched far beyond the original deal, because it meant the consequences were spreading, touching other contracts, other relationships, other parts of their business that had nothing to do with this table but everything to do with the authority that had just been exercised. The woman with the bracelets leaned back slowly, her earlier urgency replaced by a quiet realization that could not be undone. "This is going to affect everything," she said under her breath, not to Naomi, not even to the table, but to herself, and Naomi acknowledged it with the smallest nod, not in agreement, but in confirmation, because that had always been the point. Not just to stop a deal, but to expose the structure that allowed moments like this to happen without consequence. The man's phone buzzed again, this time with a message instead of a call, and as he read it, his expression shifted once more, not into panic, but into something more controlled, more serious, the kind of look that comes when someone realizes the situation is no longer temporary, it is permanent. "Our board is requesting an emergency session," he said slowly, almost as if saying it out loud would help him process it, and Naomi remained still, her presence steady, her gaze unwavering, because none of this surprised her. It was expected, calculated, part of a sequence that had already been set into motion the moment she chose not to respond to their first comment with words, but with patience. "You planned this," he said. Finally, looking directly at her now, not accusing, not even questioning, just acknowledging what had become undeniable, and Naomi held his gaze for a moment before responding, her voice quiet but absolute. "No," she said, "I prepared for it," and that distinction carried more weight than anything else that had been said, because planning implies reaction, but preparation implies understanding, foresight, control, and as that realization settled across the table, it became clear that what they had experienced was not a sudden shift. It was the result of something far more deliberate, something that had been building long before they ever took their seats, and now that it had begun, it was not going to stop. The room no longer felt like a place where deals were made, it felt like a place where consequences arrived, quietly, steadily, without asking permission, and Naomi Carter remained at the center of it without ever raising her voice, without ever needing to remind anyone of what she had just done, because the evidence was already unfolding around them in real time, in the form of alerts, messages, and shifting expressions that no one could hide anymore. The man across from her glanced at the others seated beside him, searching for alignment, for support, for anything that could re-establish a sense of shared control, but what he found instead was distance, each person now absorbed in their own screen, their own calls, their own version of the same unraveling reality, and that isolation, that quiet fragmentation of a once unified front, said more than any argument could. "We can still resolve this," he said finally, his tone shifting again, softer now, more strategic, as if recalibrating his approach in real time. "Mistakes were made, clearly, but they do not need to define the outcome," and for the first time, there was no edge in his voice, no assumption. Only an attempt, careful and measured, to regain ground that had already disappeared. Naomi listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, because she understood something he was only beginning to realize, that there are moments where resolution is no longer an option, only recognition is, and across the table, the woman with the bracelets nodded quickly, eager now, her earlier confidence replaced by urgency. "We are willing to revisit terms," she added, leaning forward slightly, her voice controlled but strained. "Adjust structure, timelines, whatever is necessary," and the shift was complete, unmistakable, because the same people who had dismissed Naomi minutes ago were now negotiating with her, not out of respect, but out of necessity, and Naomi did not respond immediately, not because she needed time, but because she was allowing them to hear themselves, to fully experience the contrast between who they had been at the beginning of the evening and who they had become now. "You are offering solutions to a problem you created," she said calmly, her voice even, not accusatory, not emotional, just precise, and the words landed with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. The advisor at the end of the table spoke again, his tone more formal now, almost procedural. "Additional notifications are coming in," he said, glancing down at his phone before continuing. "External partners are beginning to withdraw interest, citing instability." And that sentence extended the impact beyond the room entirely, because now it was no longer contained within a single deal, it was spreading outward, affecting perception, reputation, momentum, the invisible elements that hold influence together. The man's expression hardened slightly at that, not in defiance, but in realization, because he understood what that meant. Once perception shifts, it does not return easily. "This is escalating beyond what it needs to be," he said, looking directly at Naomi now, his voice steady. but lower, and you know that. And Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, her tone unwavering. No, she replied, this is exactly what it needs to be, and the certainty in her voice ended the argument before it could begin, because she was not reacting to the moment, she was defining it, and in doing so, she removed any remaining illusion that this could be negotiated back into place. The silence that followed was not empty, it was final, filled with the understanding that what had been lost was not just a deal, but control, narrative, and the assumption that power would always look the way they expected it to look. And as that realization settled across every face at the table, one truth became impossible to ignore. They had not just misjudged Naomi Carter, they had revealed themselves in the process, and that was something no contract could fix. The shift in the room was no longer subtle, it was complete, visible in every posture, every glance, every word that now carried weight instead of assumption, because the same table that had once dismissed Naomi Carter had become a place of quiet reckoning, and no one there could pretend otherwise. The man across from her no longer leaned back in dominance, he sat forward, not aggressively, but attentively, as if trying to understand a language he had ignored just moments ago. "What do you want?" he asked, and this time there was no arrogance, no performance, only a direct question shaped by the reality that he was no longer negotiating from strength. And Naomi did not answer immediately, not because she needed time, but because the question itself revealed everything that had changed. It assumed she was there to gain something, to extract value, to leverage the situation, and that assumption, like all the others before it, was wrong. "This was never about what I want," she said calmly, her voice steady, her tone measured. "It was about what you showed," and the words landed with a clarity that cut deeper than any accusation, because they pointed not to an action, but to a pattern, something larger than this moment, something that could not be undone with a single apology or a revised offer. The woman with the bracelets inhaled slowly, her expression tight, controlled. "Then let us correct it," she said, her voice quieter now. "Stripped of its earlier edge, we can acknowledge what happened here, make it right." And for a second, the room held that possibility, fragile but present, the idea that recognition might lead to restoration, that awareness might reverse consequence. But Naomi's expression did not change, because she understood something they were only beginning to grasp. Acknowledgement without accountability is just another form of avoidance. "You are trying to correct a moment," she said, her voice even, deliberate. But this was never just a moment, and the distinction settled heavily across the table, because it meant there was no simple fix, no single action that could restore what had been lost. The advisor glanced at his phone again, his tone now almost resigned as he spoke. "Media inquiries are starting to come in," he said quietly. "Someone must have flagged the sudden cancellation. Analysts are asking questions." And that development extended the impact beyond the room entirely. Because now the narrative was no longer contained, it was moving outward, into markets, into perception, into the broader world that watched and interpreted every shift in power. The man's jaw tightened slightly at that, not in resistance, but in recognition, because he understood what that meant. Once the story leaves the room, it belongs to everyone, and it rarely returns in the same form. "This will not just affect us," he said, his voice lower now, almost reflective. "It will ripple through the entire sector." And Naomi nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of a truth she had already considered. "Yes," she said simply, and the weight of that single word was undeniable, because it confirmed what they feared. This was not contained, it was intentional, not reckless, but precise, not emotional, but measured. And for a moment, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to negotiate, only the quiet understanding that what had happened here was larger than any one deal, larger than any one table. And as that realization settled, the room itself seemed to shift again, not physically, but in meaning, because it was no longer a place of opportunity, it was a place of consequence. And Naomi Carter, still seated, still composed, had not just walked away from their world, she had forced it to confront itself. The room had reached a point where no one was pretending anymore, not about power, not about control, not even about intention, because everything that had been hidden beneath polished language and rehearsed confidence was now visible, exposed in the quiet aftermath of a decision that could not be reversed. And Naomi Carter, still seated at the same place where they had first dismissed her, had become the only fixed point in a room full of shifting realities. The man across from her exhaled slowly, longer this time, not as a tactic but as acceptance, because somewhere between the first insult and this moment, he had lost something he could not recover with strategy or influence. "So that is it," he said, his voice steady but stripped of its earlier force. "There is nothing left to discuss, and Naomi looked at him, not with hostility, not even with judgment, but with clarity, the kind that does not need to be explained. There was never anything to negotiate after that moment, she replied calmly, and the finality in her tone left no room for reinterpretation. Because she was not ending a deal, she was closing a chapter that should have never unfolded the way it did. The woman with the bracelets lowered her gaze briefly, her fingers no longer moving across her phone, because there was nothing left to refresh, nothing left to fix, only the quiet understanding that they had misread the most important person in the room, and that mistake had cost them more than money. It had cost them credibility, control, and something far less tangible but far more damaging: perception. The advisor at the end of the table spoke one last time, his voice low, almost procedural. "Final confirmation has come through," he said, glancing at his screen before looking up. "The acquisition is officially terminated. All parties have been notified." And with that sentence, the last thread holding the evening together was cut, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, and for a moment, no one moved. Because there was nothing left to react to, the outcome was no longer unfolding. It had arrived. Naomi placed both hands on the table and then slowly stood, not abruptly, not as a statement, but as a natural conclusion to something already finished, and as she did, the subtle shift in the room was immediate. Chairs adjusted, eyes followed, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition, because the same people who had once overlooked her were now fully aware of her presence in a way that could not be undone. She reached for the leather folder, closed it with quiet precision, and held it at her side, her movements measured, controlled, the same composure she had carried from the beginning, unchanged by the outcome because the outcome had always been within her control. The man across from her stood as well, almost instinctively, as if acknowledging something he could not ignore anymore. "Naomi," he said, using her name for the first time, his voice lower now, more grounded. This did not have to end this way, and for a brief moment, the room held that statement, not as a challenge, but as a reflection of what could have been different, what should have been different, and Naomi paused, just long enough to meet his gaze one final time, her expression calm, unwavering. "It did," she said simply, and the truth in those two words carried more weight than everything that had been said before, because it was not about revenge, not about proving a point. It was about consequence, about drawing a line that could not be crossed without cost. And as she turned to leave the table, the silence that followed her was not empty, it was filled with understanding, the kind that lingers long after the moment has passed, the kind that does not fade, because once seen, it cannot be unseen. Naomi did not rush as she walked away from the table, and that was the final detail that stayed with everyone who watched her leave. Not the numbers, not the calls, not even the collapse of a $60 billion deal, but the way she moved with the same calm certainty she had carried when she first sat down, as if nothing in that room had the power to change her pace, her posture, or her purpose. And behind her, the silence did not break immediately, it stretched, lingering across the table, like a weight no one knew how to lift, because what had just happened could not be undone, and more importantly, it could not be reframed. There was no version of this story where they came out in control, no narrative they could spin that would erase the fact that they had misjudged the most powerful person in the room. The man remained standing for a moment longer, watching her as she moved through the ballroom, past conversations that had quietly paused, past eyes that now followed her with a different kind of attention, not curiosity, not admiration, but recognition, the kind that comes too late. And slowly, he sat back down, not because the meeting was continuing, but because there was nowhere else to go, no action left to take. The outcome had already been decided, finalized, executed with a level of precision they had failed to see until it was too late. The woman with the bracelets placed her phone face down on the table, her reflection faintly visible in the dark screen, and for the first time that evening, she did not speak, because there was nothing left to defend, nothing left to adjust, only the quiet awareness that their authority, the one they had relied on so effortlessly, had not protected them from their own assumptions. And across the table, the advisor closed his device slowly, the soft click sounding louder than it should have in the stillness, marking the end of something that had begun long before any of them realized it. And as the room gradually returned to motion, conversations resuming in lower tones, chairs shifting, glasses being lifted again, there was a difference now, subtle but permanent, because everyone who had witnessed that moment carried it with them, not as gossip, not as spectacle, but as a lesson, one that would surface the next time they looked at someone and tried to decide, too quickly, where they belonged. And near the exit, Naomi paused just briefly, not to look back, not to acknowledge the room she was leaving behind, but to adjust the folder in her hand, a small, controlled movement that reflected everything about how she had handled the evening, deliberate, precise, complete, and then she stepped forward again, disappearing into the flow of the city beyond the glass doors, where power did not announce itself, it simply moved. Quietly, decisively, shaping outcomes long before anyone else realized what was happening, and inside that ballroom, long after she was gone, one truth remained, unspoken but understood by everyone who had been at that table. Respect is not something you grant based on what you see, it is something you recognize when it is already there, and if you fail to see it in time, the cost is never just a missed opportunity, it is everything that follows.